The year was 1874, and nestled just outside Jefferson City, Missouri, was a stretch of farmland known for its stillness. Life here moved slow. Horse-drawn wagons carved paths into the earth, neighbors exchanged goods more than currency, and families built their lives from sweat and soil. It was the kind of place where the church bell rang louder than the law, and where every face was familiar, or at least supposed to be. At the end of a dirt road stood the Hawthorne farmhouse. A large, faded, gray home built in the 1830s, it sat like a forgotten relic surrounded by dense sycamores and a perimeter fence that hadn't been painted in over a decade. The structure was sound, but something about it felt off, not evil at first glance, just oddly lifeless, even with people living inside. The farmhouse belonged to Elias and Miriam Whitmore, a childless couple in their late 40s. Elias was a tall, wiry man with hollow cheeks and sunken eyes that rarely made contact with others. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was as if he were trying to remember how words worked. Miriam was softer in appearance, wearing old bonnets and carrying a worn Bible, but there was a coldness in her voice, like a winter that never ended. To the outside world, they were peculiar but harmless. They occasionally visited town for supplies, attending church sporadically and avoiding social events. Their land was overgrown in pots, their crops often failed, but no one ever offered to help, and they never asked. But what stirred quiet gossip among neighbors wasn't their reclusiveness, it was the children. Between 1871 and 1874, multiple townsfolk had noticed children arriving at the farmhouse. Some were dropped off by stagecoaches. Others arrived on foot with bags too big for their backs. Elias and Miriam claimed they were orphans, rescued from poor cities, taken in out of Christian duty. "We just want to give them a safe place," Miriam once said. "The Lord provides, and so do we." But no one ever saw the children again. No one heard laughter coming from the barn. No small footprints were seen in the muddy fields. No broken toys. No chalk drawings on wooden planks. No signs of joy or growth. Each child seemed to vanish behind the doors of the Hawthorne farmhouse, especially through the back entrance that led directly to the basement. That basement became the center of every hushed conversation. The Whitmores never allowed visitors inside, and Elias had gone so far as to board up the windows with metal bars. On summer nights, neighbors swore they saw lanterns flickering down there. Others said they heard faint sounds, whimpers, even cries. But when they got closer, all fell silent. Despite all this, nothing concrete ever surfaced. In a time before welfare checks or child protective services, one needed more than suspicion to act. People were poor. Children moved often. Death was common. And yet there was a gnawing unease that never settled. What truly alarmed the town was the consistency of disappearance. 11 children in total were known to have been brought to the farmhouse in less than 3 years. Not one had been seen since. Some families had questions. Others were too ashamed to speak up after all. Many had willingly handed their children over, believing the Whitmores were rescuers, not monsters. Only one person truly took notice and refused to let it go: Clara Doyle, a widowed woman who lived 2 miles from the farmhouse. Clara had no children of her own but taught Sunday school and occasionally offered bread to passing vagrants. She was observant, unshaken by social rules, and highly suspicious of the Whitmores. She'd watched the arrivals, counted the faces, listened at night when no one else dared. And Clara began to write down everything: the names of the children she saw, the dates they arrived, and the deliveries brought to the farmhouse, large amounts of lime, nails, and timber, none of which made sense for people who grew nothing and built nothing. To this day, it's debated whether Elias and Miriam were born evil or became it over time. But what's certain is that they exploited the isolation of rural life, the lack of law enforcement, and the trust of good-hearted people. They hid the darkest crimes not in the open, but beneath the floorboards of a quiet farmhouse, surrounded by God, fearing people too afraid or too blind to see the truth, until someone finally did. The human heart isn't built to forget a child's smile. Yet in Jefferson County, Missouri, between 1871 and 1874, 11 children arrived and vanished, without a single photograph, burial, or trace, no graves, no footprints, just silence. Their stories began with struggle. The post-Civil War years left many families in ruin. Routes plagued the Midwest, disease wiped out entire homes, and thousands of children became orphans or burdens their parents could no longer carry. The system was chaotic. Orphanages were few, and those that existed were overcrowded, underfunded, and infamous for abuse. That's where Elias and Miriam Whitmore found their opportunity. Presenting themselves as charitable Christians, the Whitmores would quietly write to orphanages in St. Louis, Kansas City, and as far as Springfield, offering to adopt or foster children on their rural land. Their letters were handwritten with care, quoting scripture and emphasizing their deep longing to raise children in the peace of God's country. With few background checks and fewer options, institutions welcomed the offers. A child gone from a ledger meant one less mouth to feed. Many didn't even send follow-up inquiries. These weren't the days of telephones or mandatory check-ins. Once a child left, their trail often ended. The children came in different ways. One boy, Samuel, was seen arriving by wagon with a nun. Locals remembered his blue wool cap and a wooden soldier he clutched. The Whitmores took him in with smiles and warm bread. He was never seen again. A pair of sisters, Ruth and Lottie, came one cold October morning. Clara Doyle, ever watchful from her kitchen window, saw them hugging each other tightly as Miriam led them inside by the shoulders. They looked no older than 8 and 10. Clara tried visiting weeks later with Pi, but Elias intercepted her at the door. "The girls are sleeping," he said flatly, but the house was silent. A mixed-race boy named Elijah, around 12 years old, had been spotted chopping wood outside the barn one afternoon. The next morning, Clara walked by again. The axe was still there. Elijah wasn't, and no one in town ever saw a child near the Whitmores' property after that day. Each child added to Clara Doyle's growing list, a ledger she hid inside the folds of her Bible. She wrote dates, descriptions, and notes on anything odd. But her journal wasn't a story yet, just fragments. Fragments that formed a horrifying picture only in hindsight. Town gossip was strong but powerless. People whispered about the Whitmores. Some claimed they had too much grief in their eyes to be evil. Others simply looked the other way. After all, what proof was there? In those days, most children worked in fields or were sent away as hired hands. A child disappearing wasn't always questioned. It was just part of life. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling. Her instincts told her that something deeply unnatural was happening inside that home. She noted the patterns, the deliveries of lime, which farmers used to reduce odors, the way the back cellar entrance was used more than the front door, the fact that the Whitmores never sent the children to church, school, or even town markets. And there was the sound, a low, desperate tapping that Clara swore she once heard from her window on a foggy morning. She couldn't be sure if it was real or imagined, but it haunted her. At this point, the town was living in collective denial. It was easier to believe the children had been sent away to farms in Kansas or relatives in Arkansas than to believe something unspeakable was happening a few miles down the road. After all, the Whitmores had Bibles in their hands and crosses over their doorways. But then came the 11th child. Her name was Meribeth, a red-haired girl with a soft voice and a noticeable limp. She came from a church-run orphanage in St. Louis. The nun who brought her left smiling, shaking Miriam's hand. Meribeth was seen by 3 different townspeople that day. Each remembered her for different reasons. Her pale blue dress, the bandage on her leg, the way she winced when climbing the porch steps. Clara, watching through her lace curtains, wrote the date beside Meribeth's name. November 5th, 1874. It was the last child the Whitmores would ever receive. Something inside Clara snapped. 11 names, 11 arrivals, 0 goodbyes. This was no coincidence. This was a pattern. A dark, deliberate ritual disguised as adoption. The town was sitting on a wound it refused to acknowledge, but wounds fester when ignored. Clara knew it was time to act, and the story of the vanishing children was about to be dragged into the light. In an era when women were expected to be quiet, obedient, and invisible, Clara Doyle refused. She wasn't a wealthy landowner. She wasn't married to a sheriff or a politician. She didn't have children of her own to stir her maternal instincts. By every standard of 1870s Missouri society, Clara should have been irrelevant, but history rarely honors the comfortable. It remembers the brave. Clara lived 2 miles from the Whitmore farmhouse. A widow for over a decade, she occupied a small cottage with a dog named Amos and a garden she tended like a sacred ritual. People often dismissed her as eccentric. She wore her late husband's coat on cold mornings and sang hymns while she baked bread. But beneath that gentle exterior was a woman of rare conviction and piercing intelligence. She noticed things others didn't, or chose not to. When the first orphan child was brought to the Whitmore's house in 1871, Clara paid attention. When the second arrived, she grew curious. By the 5th, she was alarmed, and by the 11th, she was enraged. What bothered her most wasn't just the children's disappearances. It was the town's silence. The excuses, the blindness that masqueraded as civility. "I think they've been sent to other farms," one neighbor shrugged. "They're just private people," said another. "Elias and Miriam are God-fearing folks. Don't slander them." But Clara had learned not to trust appearances. Her own marriage had taught her that. Her husband, Thomas Doyle, was respected in town, a merchant with a strong handshake and a church pew in the front row. But behind closed doors, he was cold and cruel. For years, Clara endured emotional torment, all while smiling in public. She learned then what many women learn: evil can wear a friendly face. So when she looked at the Whitmores, she didn't see recluses. She saw a pattern. A facade, a crack in the mask. Clara started writing everything down: each child, each date, what they wore, who saw them, how long they stayed before vanishing. She drew maps of their property based on what she could observe from the road. She recorded deliveries, limed timber nails, and noted the time of day Elias received them. Most critically, she wrote down what she heard at night. Clara was certain she had heard crying, not loud but muffled. Once, just before dawn, she walked near the Whitmore house under the guise of picking early herbs. She swore she heard scraping, as if someone were clawing against the inside of a wall or floor. But her suspicions alone weren't enough. She needed help. So she went to the people she trusted most: the church deacon, Reverend Thomas, and a young lawyer named Nathaniel Griggs, who had once defended a battered farm girl accused of stealing bread. Both men listened carefully, then asked the same question: "Do you have proof?" That word stung Clara like a thorn. Proof. How does one prove absence? How does one measure a child who isn't there? But Clara didn't flinch. She proposed this: "If I can gather 3 people willing to visit the house unannounced, and we find no trace of even a single child, will you act?" They agreed. Clara convinced 2 women from the local church, Mrs. Betty Sanderson and Lillian Watts, both respected and maternal in presence, to join her. On November 17, 1874, they approached the Whitmore farmhouse with baked goods, Bibles, and a fabricated story about organizing winter coats for the children. Miriam greeted them at the door with the same stiff smile, but when Clara asked to see the children, the smile faltered. "There, resting," she said. "All 11. Clara asked. "Yes, they've been under the weather." "Then we'll leave the soup by the door." But Clara didn't. She took one bold step forward, and through the crack in the door she smelled it. Something that should never be in a home: rot, bleach, and fear. She locked eyes with Miriam and said, "If you have nothing to hide, you won't mind the sheriff stopping by." 3 days later, Clara stood before Sheriff Willard Hemmings, placing her entire journal on his desk. Pages filled with names, descriptions, patterns, questions, evidence. "Read it," she said, "and tell me nothing's wrong." To his credit, Hemmings didn't brush her off. He read, and by the end his face was pale. "Will act," he said. That winter a search warrant was signed. Deputies gathered, and Clara Doyle, a widow with no official title, stood at the center of justice. Because when everyone else chose comfort, she chose courage. When silence screamed louder than truth, she listened to her heart instead of the crowd. And when darkness buried 11 children beneath the floor of a farmhouse, she dug until the light got in. The morning of December 1st, 1874, was bitterly cold in Jefferson County, Missouri. Frost painted the tips of every fence post, and even the birds seemed hesitant to sing, but the air wasn't quiet, it was heavy. Something dark was about to be unearthed. At exactly 7:15 a.m., Sheriff Willard Hemmings, accompanied by 2 deputies, Reverend Thomas, lawyer Nathaniel Griggs, and a small group of townspeople, including Clara Doyler, arrived at the Whitmore farmhouse with a signed warrant. They came not with torches or pitchforks, but with legal authority and unshakable resolve. Elias and Miriam Whitmore were startled but did not resist. Miriam protested gently, "We're just simple caretakers," while Elias stood motionless, jaw clenched, eyes empty. It was the kind of silence that comes from someone who's been expecting judgment for far too long. Clara didn't speak. She just stared at the house, her gloved hands clenched. For 3 years, she had waited for this moment. Every child's name she had written down echoed in her heart like a hymn. The interior of the house was eerily spotless. The living room was sparsely furnished. A small fire burned in the hearth. There were no toys, no shoes by the door, no clothing that indicated children had ever lived there. It felt more like a shell than a home, but it was the basement door, set behind the kitchen pantry, that held everyone's focus. It was locked with a thick iron latch, and when Sheriff Hemmings demanded the key, Elias hesitated. He turned slowly to his wife. She didn't cry, she didn't plead, she simply nodded. From inside her apron, she produced a small, rusted skeleton key. As the latch clicked open, the sheriff raised a lantern. The door creaked, releasing a smell so foul it made one of the deputies gag. A combination of mold, blood, and rotting flesh. No one spoke. They descended the narrow wooden staircase one by one, their boots creaking against damp boards. The lantern's glow revealed a chamber of unspeakable horror. The basement floor was made of dirt, but parts of it had been dug and refilled. 11 distinct mounds, each about the length of a small child. Nearby, half buried in a pile of straw and rags, were personal belongings: a doll missing an eye, a small shoe, a wooden soldier broken in half, and a faded blue dress with dried blood along the hem. More disturbing still were the chains fastened into the stone wall, short, rusted lengths of iron with worn leather cuffs at their ends. The wall was scratched, as if small hands had tried to dig their way out. Some scratches even formed the beginnings of words, help and mama. Clara's heart sank. She collapsed to her knees near one of the mounds and wept. They were here, she whispered, all of them, right here beneath our feet. Deputy Morgan, holding back nausea, began carefully digging at one of the mounds. It didn't take long. Just beneath the surface was the skeletal frame of a child, wrapped in a thin wool blanket. Beside the remains was a crude wooden cross, nailed together by hand and stained with what appeared to be dried tears or blood. Each grave they uncovered told a similar story: malnourished, abused, forgotten. Later medical examination revealed that most of the children died of starvation, blunt force trauma, or neglect-related illness. Some appeared to have been bound for extended periods. Others bore signs of untreated infections. But perhaps the most horrifying detail was that 2 of the graves were empty, as if their contents had been removed or relocated. To this day, those final 2 children have never been identified or found. As the deputies worked, Elias and Miriam were placed in separate rooms under guard. Miriam hummed to herself, rocking back and forth, speaking in riddles about cleansing the children and sending them to the Lamb. Elias said nothing until he was asked why. He answered with just 3 words: they were burdens. The news of the discovery sent shockwaves through the county. Townspeople who had once defended the Whitmores were stunned into silence. Church leaders who had praised them fell into shame. And the families who had sent their children, believing in promises of safety and salvation, collapsed in grief. The basement was sealed and later burned, but its memory could not be erased. That day, Missouri was changed. The Whitmores were charged with 11 counts of murder, unlawful imprisonment, and criminal abuse of minors. Their trial would become one of the most infamous in state history, but it all began in a basement, a place meant for storage and survival, twisted into a graveyard of innocence. And it was exposed because one woman refused to be silenced. The courtroom in Jefferson City, Missouri, had never held a crowd so large. It was January 18th, 1875, barely 6 weeks after the discovery of 11 small graves beneath the Whitmore farmhouse. The air outside was bitter, but inside the courthouse, the heat of righteous anger and morbid curiosity packed the gallery to overflowing. Farmers in muddy boots stood shoulder to shoulder with women in bonnets holding handkerchiefs to their lips. Some came to grieve, others came to gape, but all came to witness justice. Elias and Miriam Whitmore entered the courtroom in shackles. He wore a blank expression, his eyes sunken and his face ghostly pale. Miriam looked unbothered, almost smug, with her Bible clutched tightly in her hands like a talisman. But the silence that met their entrance was louder than any insult. These were not recluses anymore. They were murderers, America's worst couple. The prosecutor, young and sharp, minded Nathaniel Griggs, wasted no time laying out the case. 11 children taken in with promises of care. 11 children never seen again. 11 shallow graves in a basement filled with chains and human remains. He pointed to the Whitmores, voice trembling not from fear but fury. These children were not lost. They were not given away. They were not sent off. They were destroyed, systematically, cruelly, and without remorse. Witnesses were called. First, Clara Doyle. She stepped forward slowly, her posture upright, eyes unflinching. She brought with her the journal, the one she had kept for 3 years, containing the names, dates, and notes of each child who entered that farmhouse and never came out. She read aloud the name of each child, pausing between them as if allowing the courtroom to absorb the weight of every soul. Samuel, Ruth, Lottie, Elijah, Maribeth. By the end of her testimony, half the courtroom was in tears. Even seasoned reporters wiped their eyes. Clara stood not just as a witness, but as a monument to persistence. Without her, none of this would have come to light. Then came the testimonies of medical examiners who described the cause of death for each child. Starvation, infection, trauma to the skull, rope burns, evidence of long-term confinement. One expert testified, these children died slowly, they suffered. This wasn't negligence, this was torture. When the defense had their chance, they offered no real denial. Instead, they leaned into insanity. Elias's lawyer claimed his client was mentally disturbed from years of rural isolation and crop failure. Miriam's defense portrayed her as a victim of religious delusion, someone who believed the children were being purified for heaven. But the jury was unmoved. These weren't hallucinations. This was calculated evil. The trial lasted 10 days. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. On January 28, 1875, both Elias and Miriam Whitmore were found guilty on all counts. 11 counts of first-degree murder. 11 counts of unlawful confinement, abuse of minors, desecration of bodies. The judge, known for his normally measured tone, delivered the sentence with cold precision. You turned your home into a slaughterhouse of innocence. May God have mercy on you, for this court shall not. Both were sentenced to death by hanging, to be carried out publicly, a reflection of the severity of their crimes and the hunger of the people for closure. But the story didn't end with the verdict. Newspapers across the country picked up the case. Headlines screamed, "Hell beneath the floorboards. The Missouri murders, America's worst couple faces the noose. 11 souls silenced. The horror at Hawthorne Farm." Journalists from New York, Boston, and Chicago poured into Missouri to cover the aftermath. Editorials questioned how such horrors could go undetected for years. Social reformers demanded tighter regulations on orphan placement and child welfare. One even wrote, if not for the tireless courage of a single woman, this would have remained a house of whispers and graves. In the months that followed, Missouri passed new laws requiring official registration for private adoptions and regular welfare checks for children placed in rural homes. What began as a local tragedy ignited a national conversation on child protection, morality, and community responsibility. And Clara Doyle, she returned to her cottage refusing praise, saying only, "I did what was right. That doesn't make me special." It just makes me accountable. On the day of the execution, thousands gathered to watch Elias and Miriam Whitmore meet justice. Some cheered, some wept, most stood silently, heads bowed, honoring the children whose names were once forgotten, but who, because of this trial, would never be erased again. The story of Elias and Miriam Whitmore, the so-called worst couple in America, is not just a historical horror buried in Missouri's soil. It is more than the tragedy of 11 forgotten children. It is a mirror. One that forces us even today to ask difficult questions. How do monsters hide in plain sight? How many voices have we ignored? And how far will one person go to do what's right when no one else will? We live in a different world now. There are no horse-drawn wagons rolling into isolated farms to drop off orphans. Our homes have cameras. Our towns have laws. And yet, the spirit of this story feels just as relevant in 2025 as it did in 1874. Because silence, the kind that kills slowly and invisibly, still exists. It exists in neighborhoods where domestic violence hides behind pretty curtains. It lives in schools where children suffer in silence because no adult is willing to ask the right question. It creeps through institutions that value convenience over accountability, and in the hearts of people who think it's not my business. That's what makes Clara Doyle's courage timeless. Clara was no hero in the conventional sense. She had no badge, no power, no wealth, just conviction. She saw something wrong and refused to look away. For 3 years, she gathered whispers, tracked clues, and carried a burden most would dismiss as paranoia. She wasn't applauded for it. She was laughed at, ignored, even discouraged by those who claimed to know better. But she kept going. Why? Because truth isn't always loud, but it is relentless, and some people are just born to carry the torch into dark places, whether anyone follows or not. In today's world, we desperately need more Claras. We need people who are willing to speak up when something doesn't sit right. People who will check on the child who always seems afraid. People who ask the awkward questions. People who take notes, collect facts, and say, I don't have all the answers, but I know this isn't right. The Whitmore case led to legislative reforms in Missouri, but even more powerful than the laws it created was the cultural awakening it sparked. Suddenly, small towns couldn't hide behind politeness. Churches could no longer assume that every Bible-toting couple was holy, and orphanages had to answer for the children they handed over so freely. It was a tragedy that taught a nation one painful truth: you can't protect innocence with indifference, and that lesson still echoes. Today we must ask, are we watching our neighborhoods, our schools, our systems with open eyes? Or are we still averting our gaze the moment things get uncomfortable? The Whitmore children didn't die just because evil existed. They died because good people did nothing. But 11 lives also gave rise to one woman's voice, and that voice changed history. So what does this story mean today? It means your voice matters. It means that even if no one listens at first, keep speaking. Even if they mock you, keep writing. Even if you're dismissed, keep watching, because the greatest changes in history have never started with a crowd. They began with one person who chose truth over comfort, justice over silence, and action over fear. If Clara Doyle could take down America's worst couple with nothing but a notebook and her conviction, what could you do in your community? What injustice could you expose? What life could you save simply by refusing to walk away? It's easy to believe the world is too broken to fix, that our voices are too small, but the story of the Whitmore children proves otherwise. It tells us that the smallest candle can expose the darkest room. And while the 11 children who vanished in Missouri never got to grow up, their story lives on, not as a tale of horror, but as a warning and a charge. Be the one who listens, be the one who questions. Be the one who cares, because you never know how many lives could be saved by your decision to simply pay attention. So let their story wake you up, let it stir something in your soul, because darkness doesn't always announce itself, but when it does, light must answer. And sometimes that light is you.